All right, welcome back to the Liz Wheeler Show. I'm glad you're here today with us. I'm your host, Liz Wheeler. Before we get started with today's show, would you do me a favor? Would you bring up your Spotify app on your cell phone, search the Liz Wheeler Show, and click that subscribe button? If you could, I would so appreciate that. I appreciate everybody who's been subscribing. And if you would leave us a 5-star review, that would be great. That helps other people find the show. And I see those numbers ticking up every day. So thank you to everybody who's been leaving 5-star reviews. But if you could subscribe on Spotify, that would be great as we start today's show. I have a special episode for you today. It's actually sort of a special, not just a special episode. I spoke at Hillsdale last night to a wonderful group of students. And the topic of my speech, it was about immigration. And the title of my speech was The Plot to Subvert America. And for today's episode, I want to play that speech for you, including the question and answer with the students that followed the speech. I think you'll enjoy it. Here you go.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming tonight. If you don't know me, my name is Savannah, and I'm the chair of our YAF chapter here at the college. So if you hear something that you like tonight and you're not already involved with YAF, please come talk to me. I'd be happy to give you more information and help you get involved. But I'm going to invite up Rebecca, who's going to introduce Liz Wheeler tonight.
Good evening. I'm Rebecca George. I'm a senior at Hillsdale College studying politics, and I'm a former intern at the Claire Booth Luce Center tonight, which YAF is partnering with us for this event. And I have the privilege of introducing our speaker. Liz Wheeler is unapologetically one of the conservative movement's boldest voices today. Liz's unwavering traditional values and staunch conservative viewpoints have made her a frequent target of left-wing agitators, many of whom have waged an unrelenting and unsuccessful publicity war on her for the better part of 5 years. Unshaken, Liz forged on to publish her first book, titled Tipping Points: How to Topple the Left's House of Cards, to great fanfare in 2019. The how-to book quickly became a Publishers Weekly national bestseller, and President Trump encouraged everyone to buy a copy the same week it hit bookstores. In September of 2023, Liz published her second book, titled Hide Your Children: Exposing the Marxists Behind the Attack on America's Kids. In the 5 years since her television career began, Liz has been named one of the Red Alert Politics 30 Under 30 conservative stars, and Politico has profiled her as a star in the conservative media landscape. After 5 wildly successful years on One American News, with hundreds of episodes and hundreds of millions of views under her belt, Liz announced her departure from the network in September of 2020 to pilot a bold new media endeavor. In June of 2024, Liz announced her partnership with Blaze Media to bring the Liz Wheeler Show to Blaze TV, which now has a nationwide following spanning the spectrums of age, geography, sex, and even political affiliation. Her drive to relentlessly defend against the radical leftist takeover of our culture is born of a desire to see properly ordered society thrive in America once again. A society that values God over government, freedom over convenience, and individual liberty over victimhood and identity politics. Please join me in welcoming Liz Wheeler.
Hello, good evening. Thank you for having me today. This is my first time being on Hillsdale campus, and I'm very impressed with what you guys have got going on here. It's beautiful inside and out. So thank you for having me. Thank you to the Claire Booth Luce Center for Conservative Women. It's Young America's Foundation. It's always a pleasure and an honor to work with you. We also have a special guest today. My producer, Spencer, is with us right here in the front row. You guys might not recognize him, but you probably do know who he is because he's a former Project Veritas journalist who, in the early dawn hours several years back, was the FBI banged on his door, cuffed him, and he spent the next couple years fighting back against nebulous accusations from FBI deep staters because he had the audacity to investigate Ashley Biden's diary. So
You don't always recognize the faces of the people that are doing the really important work and suffering the, I got to tell you guys, Spencer and I were having a conversation before one of our episodes a couple weeks ago, and we were talking about, who orchestrates the agenda of the left. And we were obviously talking about the names that we're most familiar with. We were talking about George Soros and, the Tides Foundation and all the different names that we know. And I was telling Spencer, I was saying, I don't get George Soros. I truly don't understand. I understand that he wants open borders. We know that. We've known about him for a long time. I understand that he's one of the largest donors to leftist cause. He's not some person whose agenda is hidden. I know what he stands for, but I've always had a hard time defining his ideology. Because he's not a Marxist, he's not a communist, he's not a fascist, his ideology isn't as easily put into a box as some of the other politicians. In fact, in the 1980s, George Soros actually partnered with the Reagan administration to topple some communist and Marxist regimes in Europe. And so I was telling Spencer, I was like, I wish I understood why he does what he does. Because open borders itself is not an end, it's a tool. It's the means to something, but what is his something? He has always been quite reticent about articulating what his something is. And so we did what we do best. We embarked on a little research journey to try to figure out the answer to that question. And, the phrase that George Soros uses to articulate his philosophy and politics is open societies, right? And even that's kind of nebulous. What does that mean? That's a euphemism for something. Well, we dug up from the bowels of his website, actually. He has this published openly, this document that he had written 25 years ago, in which he defined what he means when he says open societies. And I want to read you a couple of these quotes, because for me, once I realized what motivated George Soros, I wondered, why do we all not realize this? So when George Soros defines an open society, this is what he says, quote, "In an open society, people can decide for themselves what they mean by freedom and democracy." And I thought, oh my goodness. So he believes in the redefinition of words. He doesn't believe in objective truth here. He goes on to say, those who say they are in possession of truth or absolute truth are making a false claim, and they can enforce it only by coercion and repression. So he believes in relativism, complete relativism. And then he goes on to connect his lack of belief, and follow along here, because once you get to the end of this train, your mind will be blown, like mine was. He goes on to connect this attack on objective truth with his belief that countries don't deserve to be sovereign nations. He says, quote, "A world order based on the sovereignty of states," which is obviously what we have, "cannot take care of our common human interests. And yet, it is difficult to intervene in the internal affairs of other countries because the principle of sovereignty stands in our way." So what does this tell us about George Soros? As we're having this conversation, we're reading this document, Spencer and I, we're saying, okay, so George Soros doesn't believe in objective truth. He believes in the redefinition of words, which is important because once you redefine words, you can also redefine morality. It's a short journey from redefining words to moral relativism. He encourages actually the redefinition. Whatever you feel democracy is, whatever you feel freedom is, that's what it really is. He wants to destroy sovereignty to make that happen. And the reason why is because he wants to destroy the culture of our nation. Because what is sovereignty but a bulwark, a protection of our norms, our traditions, our institutions, our values? That's what culture is, a collective agreement that these things that we've built our nation on are important and good. And the best way to do that is to take away sovereignty, to take away this bulwark of damaging our culture.
All right, a recent Danish study revealed something that's just heartbreaking. Women who experience abortion are dramatically more likely to need psychiatric care in the months that follow. The left tells us that abortion is healthcare, but that is not healthcare. That is heartbreak. But inside a preborn clinic, a very different story begins. A woman in crisis is welcomed and not judged. She's given comfort and not coercion. And when she sees her baby for the first time on that ultrasound screen, that flicker of light becomes something more than a medical image. It becomes hope for her. Preborn stays with her for the journey ahead with counseling, clothing, baby supplies, and encouragement that lasts up to 2 years. They care for both lives, the one who's just beginning and the one learning how to begin again. Because in the end, the greatest investment is made with compassion, and it changes 2 lives at once. Dial pound 250 and say the keyword baby. That's pound 250, keyword baby, to be part of this mission and to help save both mothers and babies. Or you can visit preborn.com/Liz. That's preborn.com/Liz. Every dollar saves lives. All gifts are tax deductible, and Preborn is a 5-star rated charity. But the real kicker was an interview that George Soros did back in 1998. It's hard to find because I assume his people, or I suspect his people, have scrubbed the web of this interview. But back in 1998, George Soros did an interview with 60 Minutes. And the interviewer, he's sitting face to face with his interviewer on 60 Minutes. And the interviewer says, "Are you religious?" to George Soros. And Soros just looks at him and says, "No. We know that he's a secular Jew. We're pretty much, it's publicly aware that he's not super religious." But then the interviewer says, "Do you believe in God?" And George Soros says no. And I realized in that moment that George Soros' hatred of our culture, his hatred of the United States, of our norms and our traditions, protected by our borders and our sovereignty, is based on a hatred of God, a hatred of Christianity. And it's always a hatred of God, isn't it? It always comes down to this. That's why they killed Charlie Kirk. That's why they're blinded by hatred of Donald Trump, even though they can't describe any reason why. Because no, Donald Trump's not terribly religious, but he is a defender of objective truth. That's why they want to destroy definitions. They want to destroy objective reality because objective reality is written by God. That's why they're seething with hatred for our nation, specifically for the United States of America, because we are built as a Christian nation. We are not built as a secular nation. We are built as a Christian nation to allow us. Our liberty is intended to equip us with the ability to glorify God. And suddenly, George Soros' support of open borders and his attacks on sovereignty, they seemed random because I couldn't define what his ideology. Suddenly, it all began to make sense. Because open borders is just a tool. It's the means. But what is the end? Well, once you do dilute the culture, once you do destroy the institutions and the norms, then suddenly the country begins to change. I mean, think about not too far from here in Dearborn, Michigan. The Muslim mayor of Dearborn, Michigan, Abdullah Hammoud, he has mosques with loudspeakers attached to the top, and they play Muslim prayer hours publicly in the city, changing the culture of that area. Why is he doing that? Why is he able to do that? Why isn't the backlash against this so strong? Because we as a Christian nation don't want that. Well, because our culture has been diluted. It's been under assault. The underlying hatred of those on the left who claim to just hate capitalism, they claim to maybe hate our definition of liberty. That's not the underlying cause of it. It's hatred of our Creator, hatred of the true founder, or the founder of the truth on which our nation is based. And when you recognize that, the plot to overthrow America that is happening as I speak to you tonight becomes chillingly clear. So what I want to do tonight is I want to talk to you about the 4 pillars of the plot to overthrow America. The first pillar is diluting a culture through an attack on borders, through an attack on sovereignty, opening the borders, letting hordes of people with no intention of assimilation coming into our country and changing the fabric, changing our norms and our traditions and our institutions. The second pillar is electing radical politicians who hate our nation and for what we stand. The third pillar is changing the voting electorate. And it's one of the reasons I'm so proud of those of you who chose to come to Hillsdale College, because one of the ways to change the voting electorate is through indoctrination. And if you walk through the doors of a traditional 4-year university in this country, you are very likely, if you walked in politically apathetic, to walk out a hardened Marxist revolutionary, because that is the purpose of most universities in this country. This institution being one of the very few exceptions to that rule. The other way to change the voting electorate is, of course, by importation, importing voters who do not love the country to which they have been allowed to live. And then the fourth pillar is fomenting violence in the streets of America in order to condition people for a violent revolution. So we talked a little bit about Pillar 1, the open borders, the dilution of a culture, and the reason that diluting a culture is harmful for a nation, because it's harmful for the values on which our norms and traditions and institutions are born or are built. But the second pillar, electing radical politicians. Back in 1993, were you guys born in 1993? No. Back in 1993, before many of you were born, the FBI wiretapped a meeting in a hotel room in Philadelphia. It was a meeting that the US government was not supposed to know about. It was a meeting of Hamas operatives in Philadelphia. And according to reporter Ashley Rinsberg, the group that was meeting in this hotel room in our nation, in the Midwest, in Philadelphia, they were known as the Palestine Committee. And the Palestine Committee, the wiretap, the FBI is listening in to this meeting of this Palestine Committee. The wiretap revealed a plan that had been hatched by Hamas to infiltrate America and American society. And the plot essentially looked like this. It had three parts, three organizational pillars to this plot. The first was a group called the Holy Land Foundation. And the Holy Land Foundation was supposed to serve as the fundraising arm. They needed money for this plot. So that was going to be the job of the Holy Land Foundation. And the second pillar of this plot was a group called the Islamic Association for Palestine. That was supposed to be in charge of the propaganda. So you have fundraising, you have propaganda, and then you had a third organization called the United Association for Studies and Research, which was supposed to be a political think tank for this Hamas plot to infiltrate America. Now, you don't have to remember each one of those groups, but one of them, put a pin on, the Islamic Association for Palestine. The reason the FBI knew about this meeting in this hotel room in Philadelphia in 1993 was because 2 years prior to that, in 1991, there was a memo written by Hamas in which they stated, the leaders of Hamas stated that they wanted to destabilize the United States from within. And they wanted to do that by creating a network of ideological actors and activities that would essentially infiltrate and ultimately subvert American institutions. They wanted ultimately to influence Congress and elected officials in our country. In other words, they wanted to infiltrate American politics with the express purpose of destroying America. Now, after this plan was hatched, 1991, this memo was written. In 1993, the FBI spies on this meeting in the hotel room in Philadelphia. They realized that it is exactly what they thought it was. The U.S. government eventually prosecuted many of the major players in this plot. One of these groups was forced to dissolve as a result of this prosecution. The IAP was forced to dissolve. But the thing is, it didn't really go away. It just changed its name. Instead, this group, and this is the group, by the way, that was responsible for the propaganda, this group reconstituted and renamed themselves the American Muslims for Palestine, a group that exists today. In fact, the man who founded American Muslims for Palestine is the same man who founded a group that I'm sure you're familiar with, Students for Justice in Palestine, a group that's incredibly popular on college campuses among leftists all across the country. Now, at the first national conference of the Students for Justice in Palestine, founded by this man who also founded the group that was a reconstituted form of a group, part of a plot to infiltrate American institutions with jihadism, they invited a man to keynote their conference, to give the address at their conference, their first conference. And that man's name was Mahmoud Mamdani. He's the father of Zohran Mamdani, the man who was just elected mayor in New York City. So suddenly it starts to make a little more sense why we hear Zohran Mamdani, this openly Muslim Marxist who won
the mayoral seat in America's most powerful city, it makes a little more sense when you hear him say things like, I got involved in politics to, quote, remake this city in our image. And you wonder when you see this video of Zohran Mamdani on camera, what do you mean? To remake this city in our image? Well, who is us? Who's our image? In what image are you going to remake this city and how? Because it doesn't sound like something an American citizen says with American values. It sounds like something said by a man who wants to remake New York City in the image of, who is he talking about? His people? He wasn't born in the United States. He espouses currently to a particular sect of the religion of Islam. It sounds like a man who wants to remake the values of New York City. Zohran Mamdani was also caught on camera saying that there's still this illusion that all of us Muslims can become New Yorkers, that all of us can settle into this city. And he claims that that is not true. Now, I do not doubt, let me say this clearly, I do not doubt the sincerity of Zohran Mamdani's socialist beliefs. He's a member of the Democrat Socialists of America. He said that he is also espouses communist ideology. I don't doubt that. I'm sure that's sincere. I'm sure he holds those views. But socialism, especially when it comes from the DSA, the Democrat Socialists of America candidates, like Zohran Mamdani, like Ilhan Omar, is a Trojan horse. Not just for socialist ideology, but for jihadist ideology. You will notice in our country this unholy alliance between communists and jihadists. Maybe surprising bedfellows, but they have one thing in common: their desire to subvert everything on which our nation was built, even if they have differences in what they want the new government that they desire to look like.
I want to pause for just a moment here and thank you for listening and for standing with us. The truth is, Blaze TV only exists because people like you refuse to let fear silence the truth. Darkness never has the final word. Not in America, not with us. This is not just about one personality or one network. It's about a family of people who believe America is worth defending and worth healing. And when you subscribe to Blaze TV, you make sure that the truth has a voice, not just today, but for the next generation. By joining with us, you're standing shoulder to shoulder with a community that knows America is still worth fighting for. You're choosing courage over censorship, truth over fear, and light over darkness. Join us, I implore you, today at blazetv.com/Liz. You can get $20 off right now. For as little as $8 a month, you can be part of shaping the future. That's blazetv.com/Liz.
Electing these radical candidates in our country, Zohran Mamdani was not an anomaly. This is a playbook that we will see replicated in cities all across the country, and it is the second pillar of the plot to subvert America. The third pillar is, how does this happen? How is it possible that a man like Zohran Mamdani can campaign openly as essentially anti-American, as a communist, and he gets enough votes to be elected in New York City? How does that happen? Well, the third pillar in this plot to subvert America is to change the voting electorate in the United States. And this is done in two ways. It's done by indoctrination and it's done by importation. As I said, we've talked for a long time about discrimination against conservatives on college campuses. I've been talking about this for over a decade. In fact, I tell this story that when I first had a cable news show, we had a segment that we did every Friday called Campus Madness, and students would send us reports of, things that professors would say to them or discrimination they faced, grades they got docked because they were conservative, and we reported on that because we thought we want to expose that. We don't want discrimination of conservatives. And I say now, a decade later, that we completely missed the point with this segment because the people in the most danger on college campuses aren't actually conservatives. Yeah, your experience is going to be terrible as a conservative on a liberal college campus, but the people actually in danger on a college campus are the students that come in politically unaware. They come in politically apathetic. They think they're apolitical. Maybe they're like lukewarm leftists, but kind of non-committal. They don't really care about it. Those are the people the college campuses are after. Because for 4 years, they face endless indoctrination and brainwashing to the point, by the time they graduate 4 years later, they have been turned into hardened Marxist revolutionaries. And they don't keep that on college campuses. They import that into their real lives, which is why one
Fifth, 20% of the voting electorate in New York City I call indoctrinated youth. It's these young people between the ages of 18 and 48. No, 48 aren't exactly youth anymore, but they're young enough that they went through these universities and faced the same indoctrination. And they voted for Zohran Mamdani not because they're unaware of his Marxism, but because they were taught in college that Marxism is moral. They actually agree with him on that. And it changes, this indoctrination changes our voting electorate. The other thing that changes our voting electorate is mass immigration. It doesn't have to be illegal immigration, but unrestricted, unassimilated immigration changes our voting demographic. If you look at the voters who voted for Zohran Mamdani, the voters who are American-born New York City voters, 49% of them voted for Andrew Cuomo. But of foreign-born New York City voters, 62% of them voted for Mamdani. That's because their values are different, because their cultural norms, their traditions, and their institutions are different. Changing the voting electorate is the third pillar of the attack on America to subvert our country. The fourth pillar is something that we've seen a lot recently, and that's political violence in our streets. Violence in American cities is not just an attack on a particular individual. It is an effort to turn neighbor against neighbor, family member against family member, to sow the seed of hatred in the hearts of Americans, to normalize and desensitize people to violence, to condition them for the moment when our country descends into what the left hopes is a violent Marxist revolution. Now, you're probably familiar with the name George Soros, if you are familiar with politics at all. But there's a man that is hiding out right now in Shanghai, China, whose name you might not be as familiar with. But I've argued recently that he has more power and more influence over US politics than even George Soros does. And I know that's a bold claim, but this man made his money here in the United States. He founded a tech company called ThoughtWorks, and he sold that company a decade and a half ago for $750 million. And after he sold this company, he moved to China. Now, we're pretty friendly here in the United States. We allow people, more people than I think we should, to live in our country. It's not too difficult to become a permanent resident of the United States. But that's not true in China. If you as an American citizen want to live in China, you have to have the express permission of the Chinese Communist Party. The government has to give you specific permission to live there. And Roy Singham is the name of this man, and he hides out in a tall apartment building in Shanghai, China, obviously having been given permission by the Chinese Communist Party. And he shares an office now with a Chinese Communist Party propaganda firm. This man has been witnessed, viewed at Chinese communist propaganda conferences, scribbling in a notebook, a red notebook with a hammer and a sickle on it. He is a committed communist. In his own words, not my inference, his words. He's a Marxist-Leninist communist. And he sends his money from Shanghai, China, through a convoluted network of leftist groups with euphemistic names that operate here in the United States. And he pays for the political violence that we see in our country. Remember the anti-ICE riots that we saw out in Los Angeles at the end of the summer? That was specifically funded. The money that came from that, or for that, was from Roy Singham. They weren't grassroots. This was not organic. This was not a bunch of people who said, you know, we have a grievance against the government. We're going to go protest this. No. This was massively mobilized events. This was paid protesters. This was lodging for people. These were signs printed. This was an operation. And the money from that operation came from a group that is funded almost entirely by Roy Singham, this American citizen who is an avowed communist who hides out in communist China so that he doesn't have to face the US Congress here. This man, Roy Singham, also funds Students for Justice in Palestine. Almost every instance, not every, but almost every instance of organized political violence. If it's a quote unquote mostly peaceful protest according to CNN, then it's probably a riot funded by Roy Singham. And the reason that this violence is part of the plot to subvert America is because Americans are good-natured and good-hearted at our core, and we don't hate each other. But if you face indoctrination long enough and you're conditioned enough to hate your neighbor, and you see this violence committed time and time again, you become desensitized to it. You become conditioned to it. Listen, you all invited me here tonight to talk about the immigration crisis and the crisis of human carnage in our country as a result of immigration, of the immigration crisis, is very real. There are what's called child recycling rings that operate in our country right now, particularly under the Obama administration and the Biden administration, where traffickers, adult males, would cross our border illegally, and to avoid being sent back, they would bring a child with them, because there was a policy under the Biden administration and the Obama administration that essentially gave them a get-out-of-jail-free card if they came with a child whom they claimed to be a biological relative, no proof necessary. And so what these bad guys would do is they would have a group of children that they would recycle. They'd bring a child and then they'd send it back, and the next guy would bring the child and send it back. And the horror of that, the fact that we allowed that, our politicians allowed that to happen. The fentanyl that comes across our southern border results in the death of nearly 70,000 young Americans every year. 70,000. To conceptualize that number is, I find, to be difficult. It is also true that when you see these videos of these migration groups crossing the rivers, and you see all these different people, it's true that they come here to overwhelm our welfare system, to overwhelm our education system, because that brings our country closer to the brink of collapse. All of that is true. The crimes that we see in our cities as a result of this influx of MS-13 gang members, that's not a coincidence. It's not a coincidence. We can and we must address that human carnage, because it's not an inevitability. All of those things that I just mentioned are a result of deliberate political choices. And we know this for a fact, because while it was happening to a much greater extent during the Biden administration, it has been stopped under the Trump administration. Well, that's not a coincidence. It's because someone made a different political decision. Someone was allowing it during the Biden administration, and someone is not allowing it during the Trump administration. But that human carnage is not the totality of the immigration crisis. It's not even the primary threat of the immigration crisis itself. Those things, as I mentioned with George Soros and his open borders, those are the means to something else. They're the tools to get to some other end. The immigration crisis itself is the means. It's not because we just need to build a wall. The immigration crisis is the means to infiltrate our nation, to dilute and destroy our culture and our traditions and our norms and our institutions through electing these radical politicians and remaking the voting electorate through the indoctrination that we see in the school system, or the importation of people who do not assimilate, even if they are naturalized as American citizens, all the while paying to sow violence in the streets of American cities. All of these things have in direct object the absolute destruction of the America that you and I love. And just like we often describe the transgender ideology as not just, a battle of stupid versus not stupid, we describe it as a battle of good versus evil. The immigration crisis is also a battle of good versus evil. And it's a step beyond that. It's a battle of Christianity and those who hate it. Unless we recognize that, it's a pivotal point, that this isn't just a pragmatic argument against the destructive impacts of mass immigration, but rather a spiritual battle in which we are engaged, whether we like it or not, then we risk losing our country. Now, the encouraging part, because I know that this was a heavy topic, the hopeful part is that in the face of incredible evil that has been unleashed on our country in the past 5, 6, 8 years, in the face of this evil, we are seeing an incredible spiritual revival. We are seeing, as people come face to face with evil, a recognition that if evil exists, well, then good must exist. And people pursuing what is good. And you know as well as I do, if you pursue that question, what is good, with an open mind and an open heart, it will lead you to the truth with a capital T. This is the first step to defeating the enemy that wants to subvert our nation. The second step The United States of America, contrary to what both major political parties tell you, was not ever meant to be a secular nation. Not ever. The United States of America was built to reflect the light of Christ. One of your advantages being here at Hillsdale is you know history. You know just a little bit about history. You know more than most people about history. Probably even after your first semester here at Hillsdale, you know more than the average American about the history of our great nation. And you know that our institutions were designed to protect our freedom, not because freedom is the ultimate end, but because freedom is the means to something greater. Freedom is the means to allow us to glorify God. Knowing our history and knowing how to use our institutions, that they are not meant to be these neutral playing fields. They are meant to protect objective truth, which of course is the colloquial term for natural law. Knowing our history and how to use our institutions is critical, and that's the second step to stopping the plot to subvert America. And the third step is a very practical, nitty-gritty step that while the right has the power in government, we must take action to use RICO laws, that's racketeering laws, to roll up all of these organizations. I mentioned a handful of them, and I could have mentioned 25 more of them, to roll up all of these organizations that plot in an interconnected, tangled web to overthrow the United States and confuse us with euphemistic names. At Hillsdale, you're already doing the first part. Or if you're not, you should be. You're already pursuing truth with a capital T. You're already part of this spiritual revival. You're also already doing the second part. You're learning the history of our nation. You're understanding that actually we were never meant to be a libertarian nation. We were never meant to have a bunch of people come to the public square and everybody bring their own values. You're free to do that. You won't be persecuted if you have a different belief. But our laws and our system and our culture was based on Christian values. The third thing is my challenge to you tonight. I come here not just to present you with facts and information. I come here to deputize you. I come here to challenge you what to do when you walk out of this room tonight. When you leave here, I want the question on your mind to be, what role am I called to play in the protection of our great nation? What are my gifts and my skills? Where can I serve to make sure that this nation, this Christian nation, which has allowed more people to come to their Creator than any other nation in the history of the world, what is my role in taking part to protect that? And I've talked to a few of you. I know the average Hillsdale student, some people ask me when I do these events, are you intimidated by the Q&A? And I usually say, nah. Except when I go to Hillsdale, then I'm a little worried I might be stumped there. But that's why the responsibility falls so heavily on you, because you are equipped. You're equipped spiritually. You're equipped with knowledge of our history and of our government institution. And now, as you prepare to launch into your careers and your families and the real world, you have a calling, a challenge, a responsibility, a duty to use those gifts that God gave you to protect your ability, your family's ability, and the ability of those around you to enjoy the liberty that allows us to be as close to our Creator as we can be on earth. Thank you so much for having me tonight. Do you guys want to do a little Q&A?
We do have time for Q&A. If you want to come stand over here, you can ask your questions.
Hi, Liz. Thank you so much for coming. You mentioned in the beginning Dearborn, Michigan, and how mosques are starting to get broadcasted. So my question was, how concerned should we be that this sort of infiltration of Islam will spread throughout the United States?
I'm very concerned about this. I think that the mosque example that I gave is an example that is especially pertinent to the cultural point that I was making, that a culture that has not been diluted, a culture where Christian norms and institutions have not been so damaged, would never allow that to happen. The community would never tolerate it. The people doing that would never think they had the backing of the local politicians to do something like that. And it's a frightening example of how successful the other side has been in diluting our culture. But that being said, we have been falsely accused on the right for a long time of being Islamophobic. If we just note that the ideology of Islam is incompatible with Western civilization. And that's not Islamophobic. It's simply true. The ideology of Islam calls for the establishment of a Muslim caliphate and the death of all infidels, those who refuse to convert to Muhammad's invented religion. And that is by the day becoming more prevalent in the United States of America. We see that. We see Ilhan Omar. And we're not just talking about foreigners coming to the United States, although both Ilhan Omar and Zohran Mamdani are not natural-born American citizens. We're talking now in the highest levels of political office, the United States Congress and in the mayoral seat in New York City, as well as the cultural influences. And I think that we on the right have done a very good job in the face of similar false accusations over the past 10 years of no longer caring if we are falsely accused of being racist. We know we're not racist. So if the left wants to, hurl those insults on CNN, like, okay, insult till you're blue in the face. We know that that's not true. We need to have similar courage when it comes to speaking firmly about the ideology of Islam, because the values or the tenets of the religion of Islam are in direct contradiction with the founding principles of the United States of America.
Hi, Liz. Thank you so
Hi.
much for coming to our campus and talking. I enjoyed listening to what you had to say. My question is regarding the apolitical students that you mentioned earlier being the target for the left-wing indoctrination. So you described them as hardened, exiting the universities as hardened Marxist revolutionaries. I don't know if you would mind kind of elaborating on what you mean by that, and then also just explaining how widespread you think this has become. Yeah, thank you.
Yes. I'll start with the second question. I think it's incredibly widespread because culturally we view college education very differently now than we did in the past. A lot more people go to college now. A lot more people go to college not just to be a lawyer or to be a doctor. They go for liberal arts education, which in and of itself might not be a bad thing if that's actually what they were experiencing in college. But that's not what they're experiencing unless they go here. So I think it's incredibly widespread. The statistic I mentioned earlier in New York City, I think is pretty illustrative because that's not exclusive to New York City. Spencer and I did an analysis of the voting demographics in New York City in the lead up to Zohran's election to see, okay, who are the people that need to be convinced not to vote for him? And I personally found it kind of disheartening when we completed this analysis and we found that 1 out of 5, that's a lot of people. That's a way bigger number than is needed to change the outcome of an election. But 20% of the registered voters in New York City were people who had gone through liberal colleges and universities, which means that 1/5 of people in the biggest city in the United States not only were victimized by this, but they're importing it now into the political sphere because they believe the things that he's saying are right and true and good. And it's not a one-off in New York City. We're going to see that in cities all across the country because they've tried this playbook and they realized they no longer have to hide the fact that a communist candidate is a communist. He doesn't have to, soften his socialism. You can just be completely open about it as long as the voting electorate is there. So I think it's an incredibly dangerous situation that we're facing. If I were President Trump, I would take action and I would begin to deprive all forms of federal funding to universities that actively indoctrinate students. He has the power to do this, not just with public universities, but with private universities. You can say you're not going to get any federal funding through federally subsidized student loans, through research grants. I mean, for Medicaid, for goodness sake, healthcare on college campuses. Every college and university, except for maybe this one, in the country is absolutely reliant on government money. If you took all forms of direct and indirect government money away from colleges and universities, the vast, vast, vast majority, if not all of them, would completely shut down in a matter of years. And while that's not exactly what I'm suggesting that I want, they would also have the choice to course correct and stop indoctrinating if that pressure were put on them. And given the severity of how significant this problem is and how you can see it playing out, we just did in November. The outcome of an election was changed by this. It's not just, oh, stupid young people will learn their lessons when they start paying taxes. No. That might have been true 30, 40 years ago, but this is a very different situation we're facing. President Trump has the authority as chief executive. His Department of Education has the authority to start cracking down on these indoctrination factories. And I think he not only should, but if he doesn't, then this is something we're going to face a lot more. So that's a long answer to the second part of your question. The first part of your question was defining what I mean by a hardened Marxist revolutionary. And what I mean by that, I'll give you a specific example. The transgender ideology is not just confusion about definition of terms. It's not just, oh, you can define a boy how you want and a girl how you want, or, rejection of objective truth. It's more than that. The transgender ideology is actually the outgrowth of a neo-Marxist theory called queer theory. And queer theory seeks to use sex as a political tool. And what they do is they target vulnerable youth who are mentally ill, who are confused about their body. They often target autistic youth who feel uncomfortable in as they exist to begin with. And they not only physically, mentally, and emotionally harm these individuals by putting them on this destructive path towards transition, they also propose this idea very subtly in young people's minds that, if you're a white man in America today, you're told by the left that you are inherently racist based on the color of your skin. And not because of anything you did or said or thought, how you treated anyone, but just because someone who might have looked like you hundreds of years ago did something bad to someone who didn't look like you. And there's nothing you can do to escape it. You're irredeemable. That's what they tell young people that look like you. That's what critical race theory teaches. And it's kind of this punch. Young men especially are just feel this incredible self-loathing, because why wouldn't they? They're being told they're evil for something they didn't do. And it creates this identity crisis, internally at least, in young people. And then along comes the transgender ideology. And the transgender ideology says, you know what? If you're tired of feeling like you're the bad guy, if you're tired of feeling like you're the oppressor, I have something that can save you from your fate. I have something. If you reject your family, if you reject your God, if you reject biology, if you reject truth, and you instead put on this mantle of a transgender ideology, then suddenly you're not the oppressor. You are now the marginalized. You are now the oppressed. And so what it does, while also harming physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually, while also assaulting objective truth, it turns these children into essentially, or young people, not just children, into slaves of this ideology, this dialectic, this oppressed versus oppressor. And so they go out into the world now, and most college students, not at this college, most college students think that gender is however you feel. They are thoroughly indoctrinated in this ideology. These students go out into the world viewing everything through this lens. Are you the oppressor or are you the oppressed? And if you view the world like that, that is what Paulo Freire once called critical consciousness. It is the way to indoctrinate youth in how to view every bit of culture and society through a Marxist lens. And ultimately, it will lead to political actions taken, whether it's valid political actions like an election or invalid political actions like assassinations to happen because of that ideology that was planted in these young people. And that example of the transgender ideology is just one of the many ways that the minds of these youth in schools are captured and turned from apolitical, maybe even suffering, into really hardened revolutionaries. Thank you.
Hi, Liz. Thank you so much for being here. You are one of my inspirations and role models.
Oh, thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. So you very clearly articulated the hate against Christianity is what is fueling this agenda to dilute American values and culture and then to subvert it with something else. What I didn't think was super clear was a comment you made in the beginning. When George Soros was in his interview, he was asked, are you religious? No. Do you believe in God? No. And then you jumped to, that's a hatred of Christianity. Spiritually, I can see that argument immediately. I'm just thinking of like maybe some liberal people I know who would say, aha, a conservative is just making a broad blanket statement. Can you elaborate more on the connection? Maybe George Soros has said something more explicitly?
Yes.
Because I don't see how him saying, I don't believe in God, equates to I hate Christianity.
Yes, as an excellent question and an excellent defensive posture to anticipate what the left is going to say in response. This is a quote from George Soros. Quote, I fancied myself as some kind of God. It is a sort of disease when you consider yourself some kind of God, the creator of everything, but I feel comfortable about it now since I began to live it out. End quote. So as human beings, we are wired to worship. As human beings, you can deny the reality that we are both flesh and mortal and that we are also spiritual beings, but that's the reality of our existence here on earth. We are mortals bound by the eternal. And we are wired to worship. And we either worship rightly or we worship wrongly. We either worship the God who created us or we worship false idols. And when and if you worship a false idol, whether you have dedicated your life to that, as George Soros describes, engaging in self-idolatry, or whether, as all of us do, since we have all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, we engage in some kind of false worship once and then repent for that. It is as clear as that binary choice. If you are worshiping a false idol, then you are not just, it's not just an absence of the right God. It is a rejection of the right God. If you reject Christ, that is a hatred of Christ, because Christ is love, and the absence of love is hatred. And so your question is extremely good. It's extremely well thought out, and I'm glad you brought that up. But I think that there is substantial evidence that George Soros is not just religiously apathetic. He doesn't just not believe in God. He considers himself a God. He claims that he lives his life viewing himself as the God, which is, of course, a form of self-idolatry and wrong worship that requires the rejection of our God, who we know is love.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you for coming tonight. We as conservatives, how should we reconcile Trump's strong stance against illegal immigration with his staunch support for student visas? According to the Heritage Foundation, currently 27% of our Ivy League universities are foreign nationals. Last week when talking with Laura Ingraham, he doubled down on his move to import Chinese visas, saying that he would more than double it to 600,000. And I'm wondering how those policies are America first.
Yeah, it's a good question. One of my favorite parts of working in the media and not working in politics is I don't always have to think about the same way that politicians do, how to gently criticize a political policy that I disagree with. I totally disagree with Trump, respectfully, on those two issues. I don't know why he supports those two issues. We've certainly made an effort and continue to make an effort to communicate to him why so many people like you and I do disagree with him. One of my favorite things about President Trump, and I think something that sets him apart from any other, not just presidents, but any other politician that I've ever known, is he's willing to listen. If he doesn't understand why you feel a certain way and you explain to him why you feel a certain way, this man actually listens and intakes what you say, thinks about it, and if he thinks there's validity to it, he changes his policy. And I'll give you a specific example. It doesn't have to do with immigration, but there's a story that country singer John Rich tells. He said, I was having dinner with President Trump and some other people at the table, and President Trump turns to me, and this is before he was elected last year. And he said, you know, at my campaign rallies, John, anytime I mention Operation Warp Speed, the COVID vaccine, he's like, which I'm really proud of, my audience, you know, they boo. Why is that? And he asked this with actual intellectual curiosity. He asked John Rich. And John Rich tells the story. He's like, Lindsey Graham was sitting across the table from me, and Lindsey Graham tried to interrupt and like divert the conversation. And John Rich goes, excuse me, the president's talking to me. And he turns to Donald Trump and he says, Mr. President, because every single person at that rally knows someone who has been harmed by the COVID vaccine. And the president turns to him and goes, nobody's ever told me that before. And from that moment on, for the remainder of the campaign, President Trump did not mention the COVID vaccine, and he has stopped promoting it, and his CDC has reversed recommendations for it. This man, I have so much respect for someone who is willing to change how they think when their data inputs inform them differently. Like, how much pride do we all have? How difficult is it for us to lose face when we're like, oh, shoot, I was wrong about that, but man, I can't say I was wrong about that. I'll look so stupid. This man, in the most visible office in the entire world, is willing to change his position when he understands why something means something to the American people. And so in this instance, when it comes to H-1B visas and student visas, it's incumbent on you to explain to him why it hurts you. H-1B visas, it's not just a matter of importing highly skilled workers into the United States. Sure, maybe there should be some exception for genius visas for very specific jobs that maybe our university systems are inadequately training American citizens for, but you should explain to him, you should say, Mr. President, in 1990, the average 30-year-old, and I know you're not quite 30, but the average 30-year-old in 1990, over 50% was married and owned a home. But today, in 2025, less than 10% of 30-year-olds are married and own a home because you can't afford a home. You can't, because inflation has caused the price of houses to go so high. And why is that? Because we've imported all of these foreign-born workers, and it's hurting you. It's hurting your prospects. Maybe you want to get married and start a family, and you're like, well, how am I supposed to have 5 kids in an apartment that I'm losing money because I'm paying rent on? You need to have a house. You need the suburbs. This was always the American dream. President Trump's willing to listen if you talk to him. He's willing to listen. And on China, I think he's wrong on the Chinese students. Chinese students, whether or not they know it when they come here, and many of them do, but some of them don't, Chinese students are spies for the Chinese Communist Party. They are coerced into getting information and reporting back to Chinese military and Chinese intelligence services. And if they don't, then their own visas are revoked by the Chinese government, or their families face pressure and harm and retribution in China. And we know the Chinese have a long-term plan to also subvert and infiltrate the United States. And they're doing that through stealing our technology and bringing bioweapons into the United States and taking American taxpayer money and creating bioweapons at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And President Trump's not correct that we need them to be trained at American universities, but he needs you to explain to him why. I highly suggest you do that. Thank you guys so much. I appreciate it.